St. Augustine Hospital is a place where life and death coexist in an unavoidable symbiosis. Over the years, I've learned to accept this duality without questioning it too much. As a nurse in the morgue, my job is to care for bodies that no longer belong to the world of the living, making sure they receive the respect they deserve before their final journey. It's a lonely and somber job, but I had grown accustomed to the routine, the heavy silence of the underground corridors, and the cold fluorescent light illuminating the metal tables. At least, that's what I thought. My name is Laura Carter, and I've been working at the hospital for over a decade. The morgue never bothered me. In fact, I found a strange kind of solace in its serenity. There was no rush or chaos here, only a calm that let me reflect on the fragility of existence. However, a few months ago, something changed. Something began to stalk this place I used to consider a refuge of tranquility. It all started one night at the end of my shift. I was finishing up reviewing the records, making sure each body was correctly identified before the funeral home staff arrived to pick them up. There were 3 bodies in the morgue that night, all victims of a car accident on the outskirts of the city. A whole family tragically interrupted on their way back home. The husband, the wife, and their 6-year-old daughter. As I approached the first table, a sudden chill hit me, as if a gust of icy wind had swept through the room. I stopped dead, confused. The morgue had always been cold, but this was different, more intense, almost unnatural. It was a cold that seeped into my bones, down to the marrow. I decided to ignore it and continued my work, assuming that maybe the ventilation system had kicked in harder. But as I moved from one table to the next, the cold grew stronger, concentrating around the little girl's body. I tried not to give it too much importance, though a part of me couldn't shake the growing unease. That night, when I got home, exhaustion overwhelmed me quickly, but my sleep was restless. I dreamed of the morgue, of the little girl on the metal table. In my dream, she was awake, her eyes open and empty, staring straight at me. I woke up sweating, my heart racing, and despite how cold the room felt, I couldn't fall back asleep. I spent the rest of the night wondering if I was becoming paranoid. The following nights were even more disturbing. Every time I entered the morgue, the cold intensified, always centered around the girl's body. My hands went numb when I touched the chart on her table, and I felt a pressure in my chest, as if the very air were charged with a presence I couldn't understand. I became more and more reluctant to go in alone, but I had no choice. This was my job, and I couldn't afford to succumb to fear. One Friday night, while preparing the bodies to be picked up the next day, something happened that I'll never forget. I was checking the mother's body when the cold returned, more penetrating than ever. Suddenly the lights flickered, and a strange creaking sound echoed in the room. I froze, listening, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It seemed to come from the table where the little girl lay. Cautiously I approached, my breathing growing faster with every step. The air felt heavier, almost as if I were walking underwater. When I reached the table, I noticed the girl's body looked different, as if her position had changed slightly since I last saw her. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but when I reached out to adjust the sheet covering her, a chill ran down my spine. In that instant, the lights went out completely, plunging me into total darkness. My heart pounded, and panic started to take hold. I was trapped in the morgue, surrounded by bodies in complete darkness. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't respond, as if the cold had frozen them in place. Then, in the middle of the darkness, I heard a whisper, a soft, low sound, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. It was the voice of a little girl. The whisper repeated, louder this time, but I couldn't make out what it was saying. I wanted to run, to get out of there, but fear kept me rooted to the floor. Finally, I gathered enough courage to move and fumbled around for my flashlight. My hands trembled so much that I almost dropped it several times before turning it on. When the light finally lit up the room, the whisper ceased, and the overhead lights flickered back on with a buzz. I looked around, expecting to see something out of place, but everything seemed normal. The bodies were still on their tables, unchanged, but the cold remained, even more intense than before. I finished my work as quickly as I could, avoiding looking at the girl again, and headed to the exit, feeling as though something was watching me from the darkness. That night, when I got home, I couldn't sleep. The image of the morgue in the dark, the whisper, the cold that seemed to envelop me, all played over and over in my mind. I knew something was wrong, something I couldn't explain or understand. Over the weekend, I tried to distract myself, to stop thinking about what had happened, but anxiety wouldn't leave me alone. I dreaded going back to the hospital, terrified of what I might find the next time I was alone in the morgue. On Monday, I returned to work with a sense of unease I'd never before experienced. When I got to the morgue, I noticed the cold had intensified. It wasn't just a physical sensation, but a presence, something that felt alive, though not in any way we know. I decided not to get too close to the girl's table and focus on the other bodies that had arrived over the weekend. Yet the pressure in my chest grew stronger as the night wore on, and the whisper returned, clearer this time. My heart pounded. When I finally understood what it was saying, it was a single word, repeated over and over like a lament. Help me. The whisper came from everywhere, echoing off the morgue's cold walls. I tried to ignore it, to focus on my work, but each time I heard it, it felt like the cold drained my energy, as if the invisible presence was feeding on my fear. That night, I couldn't finish my shift. I was trembling, unable to think clearly, and begged a co-worker to cover for me before I ran out of the hospital. I spent the rest of the night awake, convinced the whisper still followed me, repeating that word over and over in my mind. The next day I spoke to a colleague about what I'd been experiencing. I didn't go into detail, but mentioned that the morgue felt different, that the cold was more intense, and that I noticed strange things. He looked at me with a mix of disbelief and concern, but said nothing. Afterward, I decided to investigate more about the family who died in the accident. I discovered that the little girl had survived the initial impact, but died in the hospital after several hours of agony. She was the last to die, alone, while her parents were already in the morgue. With that information, I began to suspect the girl had not found peace, that something kept her trapped in the cold of the morgue, forcing her to stay, desperately seeking help. My name is Anna Baker, and I'm a nurse at St. Raphael Hospital. For the past 15 years, I've devoted my life to caring for others, always believing my work is a calling. I've lived through difficult and heart-wrenching moments, but I've also experienced the gratitude and hope our efforts can bring. However, what happened to me a few years ago changed my perspective forever. This is my story, a story of supernatural horror I never thought could be real. It was a cold winter night. The wind howled outside the hospital and snow piled up against the windows, creating an atmosphere of loneliness and isolation. The night shift had begun in a routine manner, with most patients asleep and only a few requiring constant attention. I was used to the stillness of these hours, when the hospital felt like a separate world, removed from the daytime bustle. As I was reviewing the charts at the nurses' station, I noticed an elderly man walking down the hallway. I was surprised, as I hadn't seen him before, and his appearance was unusual. He wore a faded hospital gown, and his eyes, though weary, seemed filled with profound despair. He moved slowly, as if each step took monumental effort. I approached him and asked if he needed help, "My name is Mr. William Howard," he said in a trembling voice. "I'm looking for my room." I offered to take him back, but when I checked the records, I couldn't find his name assigned to any room. I thought there might have been a mistake, so I settled him in an empty room and promised to investigate further. Mr. Howard thanked me and lay down on the bed, seeming relieved. That night, as I continued my rounds, I couldn't stop thinking about him. There was something about his presence that unsettled me, something I couldn't explain. When I returned to his room later to see how he was doing, I found it empty. The bed was perfectly made, and there was no sign anyone had been there. I asked my co-workers if they had seen the elderly man, but none of them remembered seeing him. Their answers made me doubt myself. Had I been hallucinating, or was it just my tired mind playing tricks? I decided to let it go and focus on my work, but the sense of unease remained. In the following nights, Mr. Howard appeared again, always during my shift and always in the same waiting area. Each time I tried talking to him, his answers were vague and confusing. He shared fragments of his life, mentioning his family and a son he hadn't heard from in years. His sadness was palpable, and every encounter left me more disturbed. Finally, I decided to dig deeper. I went through the hospital's old records and found something astonishing. Mr. Howard had indeed been a patient here 20 years ago. He had died one winter night under circumstances that appeared natural, yet there was something odd in his file. Right before he died, he had insisted he needed to find his son, that he had to say goodbye to him. This discovery chilled me. Was it possible that Mr. Howard's spirit was trapped in the hospital, searching for his lost son? The idea was terrifying, but I couldn't ignore what I had seen and felt. One night, as I was in the break room, I heard a whisper, "Anna, please help me." I turned, and there was Mr. Howard standing at the door. His figure was barely visible in the dim light, but his eyes shone with desperate intensity. "I can't find my son," he said, his voice trembling. "Please help me." I decided I had to do something. I started looking for information on his family, trying to find his son. I searched records, called numbers, and spoke with long-time hospital employees. Finally, I found a clue. His son Robert lived in a nearby city. However, he hadn't been in contact with his father for years and didn't know he had passed away in the hospital. I managed to contact Robert and told him what I had discovered. He was skeptical at first, but eventually agreed to come to the hospital. I explained everything I knew and took him to the room where Mr. Howard usually appeared. We waited in silence, the air heavy with tension. That night, Mr. Howard appeared again. Upon seeing Robert, his eyes filled with tears. "Robert, my son," he whispered. And in that moment, his figure began to fade slowly. Overwhelmed and full of sorrow, Robert fell to his knees and started sobbing. "Dad, I'm so sorry," he said between sobs. "I didn't know you were here." The air in the room became lighter, and for a moment I felt an indescribable peace. Mr. Howard disappeared completely, and his presence no longer haunted the hospital. Yet the impact of that experience left an indelible mark on my soul. After that night, Mr. Howard's appearances ceased, but the emotional aftermath remained. Robert and I stayed in touch, and he thanked me for helping his father find peace. However, the experience had changed something in me. The nights at St. Raphael Hospital were never the same again. I always felt a presence, a shadow lurking in the corners, reminding me there are things beyond our understanding. Months went by, and the hospital returned to its usual routine. Still, for me, the nights were filled with indescribable tension. I started researching more about supernatural phenomena, trying to find a logical explanation for what I had experienced. I spoke with other co-workers at the hospital. Although some shared strange stories, none were as vivid and personal as mine. One night while on duty, I heard a familiar whisper, "Anna, thank you." I spun around. but saw no one. The chill that ran through me confirmed Mr. Howard was still there, grateful, yet finally at peace. I decided to share my story, not just as a warning, but as a testament that there are forces in this world we don't fully understand. My story became a source of comfort for some and fear for others. Some hospital employees began paying more attention to murmurs in the hallways and shadows in the corners. Despite it all, I continued working at St. Raphael. The experience with Mr. Howard made me more compassionate and reminded me of the importance of being present for patients, not just physically, but emotionally. Whenever I see an elderly patient walking down the halls, I remember Mr. Howard and make sure to offer them a kind word or a smile. With time, I met other patients who also seemed to have unfinished business. Although none were as intense as what I experienced with Mr. Howard, each encounter reminded me there is something beyond life and death, something that connects us and transcends us. One night, while reviewing records, I saw an older woman sitting in the waiting area. She looked calm, but I sensed a familiar sadness in her eyes. I approached and asked if she needed help. "I'm looking for my daughter," she said softly. I felt a shiver, and I knew I was about to begin another story, much like Mr. Howard's. These supernatural experiences became part of my life at the hospital. Each story was unique. Each spirit had its own sorrow and hope. I learned to face my fears and accept there are things we simply cannot fully understand. Over time, hospital staff started coming to me when they noticed something strange. My reputation as the nurse who could communicate with spirits spread, and though some looked at me with skepticism, most supported me. They understood my role, went beyond physical care, that I was there to provide comfort not just to the living, but sometimes to the dead. Though these experiences were often terrifying, they filled me with a deep sense of purpose. I knew I was doing something meaningful, something beyond medical skills that touched the human soul at its deepest level. Today, I still work at St. Raphael Hospital. My life has changed forever, and though some nights are still filled with shadows and whispers, I've learned to accept them and find peace in my role. Each appearance, each lost spirit, is an opportunity to help someone find solace and close a painful chapter. My story is not just a testament to the supernatural, but also a reminder that we must pay attention to the whispers in the darkness and the shadows hidden in plain sight. Sometimes those who have departed just need someone to listen, someone who can help them find the path to the light. St. Luke's Children's Hospital is a place where life and death coexist in a peculiarly intimate way. As a nurse in the pediatric unit, I have witnessed miraculous recoveries that defy all medical logic, as well as tragedies that shatter families in the blink of an eye. Since I started working here, I've learned to maintain a professional attitude, a kind of emotional shield that allows me to care for my young patients without falling apart at every devastating piece of news. But a few months ago, something happened that cracked that shield, something that changed my life forever. My name is Elizabeth Reed, and I had been working for 5 years in the pediatric unit when I first noticed the presence of a child who did not appear in any medical records. It was just another morning when I saw him. He was in room 204, a room normally left empty unless every other one was full. He had messy blonde hair and his pale face was sprinkled with freckles. He wore a hospital gown, and at first I didn't think much of it. I assumed he was a new admission no one had told me about. I continued my rounds, checking each child. In their bed, adjusting medication dosages as required, making sure everyone was comfortable. By the end of the morning, I found myself near room 204 again. I decided to take a quick look to see how the boy was doing, but when I entered, the bed was empty. I assumed one of my co-workers had moved him somewhere else for a procedure, but when I later asked around at the nurses' station, no one knew of any new patient. They insisted room 204 was unoccupied. That first sighting of the boy didn't concern me too much. I thought maybe I was confused, that fatigue was starting to get to me. After all, the long shifts in pediatrics can be exhausting, and it wouldn't be the first time my mind played tricks on me. But what happened afterward couldn't be dismissed as simple exhaustion. A week later, during the night shift, I saw the boy again. He was sitting in a corner of the hallway next to the vending machine. I stopped and observed him for a moment. He seemed to be playing with something in his hands, maybe a small toy. What struck me was that, although he was clearly a little kid, he didn't emit the usual childish energy. He was silent, completely absorbed in whatever he was holding. I moved closer to him, but before I could reach him, he just wasn't there. A chill ran down my spine. I looked around, but there was no trace of the boy. The hallway was empty and quiet, except for the distant hum of the monitors. That night, after my shift, I went home feeling uneasy. I tried to relax, telling myself it must be work-related stress, but that explanation felt less and less plausible as the days went on. I started seeing the boy more often, always when nobody else was around. Sometimes I would spot him standing at the door of a room, looking inside with a blank expression. Other times, I found him in the playroom, sitting on one of the small chairs, watching the other kids as they played, though he never joined them. I didn't know what to do. Telling my co-workers seemed like a bad idea. What would I say? That I was seeing a boy who didn't exist in the hospital's records? They'd surely think I was losing my mind, or at best, too exhausted to do my job effectively. So I kept it secret, hoping the visions would fade on their own, but they didn't. One night, I decided to take matters into my own hands. It was a quiet shift, with all the patients stable and asleep. I used the free time to investigate. I reviewed the records for room 204, the admission reports, the doctor's notes, but I found nothing about a recent patient there. This only fueled my curiosity and my concern. How could a child keep appearing in the hospital without leaving any trace? I dug deeper, going through older archives. Finally, after hours of searching, I discovered something. 5 years ago, a boy named Samuel Fisher had been admitted to the hospital. He was 7 years old and underwent emergency surgery for a complicated appendicitis. What should have been a routine procedure turned fatal. There had been an error in administering anesthesia, and Samuel never woke up. The story was tragic enough, but what froze my blood was the place of his death, room 204. While reading the report, I felt as though the air around me had grown heavier. Room 204, which now lay unused most of the time, was the same one where Samuel had spent his last hours. I couldn't help but think that the boy I had been seeing was Samuel, or what remained of him. The idea was unsettling, yet it explained a lot. I decided I had to do something. Maybe, just maybe, Samuel needed help finding peace. That night, I returned to room 204 after everyone else had left. It was completely dark except for the faint glow of the corridor light spilling through the slightly open door. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The room was colder than it should have been. I approached the bed, which was perfectly made, and stood there, feeling a strange mix of fear and determination. I didn't know exactly what I was doing, but I knew I couldn't keep ignoring what was happening. As I stood there in silence, I felt a presence behind me. Slowly I turned and I saw him, Samuel, standing by the window, looking at me with those blank, expressionless eyes I now recognized. My heart pounded, but I stayed put, waiting. The boy didn't move. He seemed stuck, as if waiting for something but not knowing what. In that moment I realized Samuel didn't know he was dead. He was trapped, caught in an endless loop of confusion and loneliness. A wave of compassion washed over me. I couldn't imagine how terrifying it must be to be stuck like that without understanding what was happening. In a soft voice, though I doubted he could really hear me, I spoke. I told him I was sorry, that it had all been a terrible accident, and that now he was safe. I told him it was okay to leave, that he didn't have to stay here anymore. There was no immediate sign that he heard me, but gradually the room's oppressive atmosphere grew lighter, less suffocating. Samuel looked at me for another moment, and then, without a sound, simply vanished. The room returned to normal, and I realized I was shaking. I didn't see Samuel again after that night. Room 204 stayed as quiet as ever, and the hospital carried on its daily routine. I told no one about what happened, not even my closest colleagues. Who would believe me anyway? I decided it would be my secret, something I'd carry with me, reminding me that sometimes, in the realm of medicine, things aren't always what they seem. Since then, every time I pass by that room, I feel a strange mix of peace and sadness. I think of Samuel, his small figure by the window, and I wonder if he finally found the rest he deserved. I don't know exactly what I saw or how it was possible, but I know this. Sometimes the ghosts of the past find a way to manifest, seeking a resolution they were denied in life. Now, when I care for my patients, I do so with a greater awareness of the lives that have passed through this hospital, of the untold stories left behind. A hospital is a place filled with life, but also with memories. And though not all those memories are pleasant, I believe it's important to acknowledge them, so that any souls who remain trapped can finally find peace. Despite what happened, I continue working in the pediatric unit. I can't help feeling I have a responsibility not just to the living, but also to those who, in some mysterious way, were left behind. Every time a child is admitted, I do my best, remembering that my job is not only to save lives, but also to ease suffering, whatever its source. And though I haven't experienced anything quite like what happened with Samuel again, I know the hospital still holds secrets, tucked away in its corridors, waiting to be discovered. I don't know if I will ever encounter another of those secrets, but if I do, I'll be ready. Because I've learned that sometimes the real cure isn't in medicine, but in recognizing and closing the stories left untold. Working in a hospital always involves confronting the unexpected. Over the years I've spent as a nurse, I've witnessed stories that defy all logic and explanation. However, none of those experiences compare to what I witnessed during that night shift that changed my life forever. The night was dark and stormy, as if the sky itself anticipated the tragedy that was about to unfold. My name is Eleanor, and that particular shift had started like any other. There was a tense calm in the air, mixed with the distant sound of heart monitors and the soft buzz of fluorescent lights. As always, I prepared to face the night alone, with only sleeping patients and my own thoughts for company. It was around midnight when I got the first call from the intensive care ward. The voice on the other end was my co-worker Sarah, whose quick, agitated breathing indicated concern. She told me about a patient, Mr. Rodriguez, who claimed he kept seeing a strange figure in his room. "He says there's a nurse with no eyes watching him from the corner," Sarah said, her tone revealing both skepticism and a certain fear. I didn't pay it much mind at first, attributing it to his condition. Still, something about the description deeply unsettled me. I vaguely recalled rumors among staff about odd occurrences during the night, but I never imagined I would face something like this so directly. I decided to check for myself, not out of fear of the supernatural, but because it was my duty to ensure patient well-being. When I arrived at Mr. Rodriguez's room, I found a scene that froze my blood. The patient, An older man who looked tired and vulnerable lay in his bed, his eyes wide and fixed on the far corner of the room. "Mr. Rodriguez, I'm Nurse Elena. Are you all right?" I asked calmly as I slowly approached him. The man blinked several times, as if awakening from a deep sleep, and then looked at me with genuine terror etched into his wrinkled face. "She's here in the corner. The nurse with no eyes is watching me." My heart skipped a beat at hearing his words. It was obvious Mr. Rodriguez was completely convinced of what he was seeing. I tried to calm him, meticulously checking the room for anything that might explain his experience. There was no one there but the two of us. "Please relax, Mr. Rodriguez," I said, fighting to keep my own voice steady. "I don't see anyone else in the room. Maybe it was a dream or an illusion." He seemed to want to believe me, but his eyes kept darting to the same corner, as if hypnotized by the invisible presence only he could perceive. After a few minutes, I managed to calm him enough for him to close his eyes and drift into a restless sleep. I left the room with my heart pounding and my mind racing with questions. What had caused Mr. Rodriguez's experience? Was he truly seeing something supernatural? Or was there another explanation? I tried to remain calm and continued with my duties, but the sense of unease never left me. Hours later, when I thought the worst had passed, I received another call, this time from the oncology ward. Several patients had reported similar sightings. The description was alarmingly consistent. A female figure dressed like a nurse, but with no visible eyes, watching them from the shadows of the night. My mind struggled to find a rational explanation. Maybe a collective psychotic episode, extreme stress, or unknown side effects of medication. I tried to keep my composure as I made my way to the oncology ward, but I felt like I was stepping into a nightmare. Reality sank in even more when I got to Mrs. Thompson's room, a terminal patient who had been in a medically induced coma for weeks. The nurse on duty, Caroline, greeted me with a worried look and silently led me to the woman's bedside. The room was wrapped in a disturbing half-light, lit only by the faint glow of a monitor and the occasional flash of lightning outside. Mrs. Thompson lay motionless, her pale features illuminated by the bluish glare of the screen, reflecting her heartbeat. But what made me hold my breath was what I saw in the far corner of the room. There, in the darkness, stood a blurry figure, barely visible but undeniably present. It was a female form in a white nurse's uniform, head tilted slightly, as if watching the patient with interest. The most disturbing aspect was that where the eyes should have been, there was only a dark void, a hollow space on an otherwise pale, serene face. I heard Caroline whisper, "Do you see it, Elena?" Her voice trembled with fear and awe. I couldn't look away from the figure. My mind fought to understand what my eyes were showing me. Mrs. Thompson remained unconscious, unaware of the presence, watching her from the shadows. Instinctively, I scanned the room, searching for any rational explanation, any detail that would prove the terrifying sight was a trick of the light. But there was nothing to dispel the horror. I decided to face the situation directly. I approached the figure cautiously, a mix of fascination and terror enveloping me like a cold fog. With each step closer, the figure seemed to waver slightly, as if aware of my presence, but unwilling to vanish entirely. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. I got no response, only an oppressive silence that filled the room with a foreboding atmosphere. It felt like an eternity, but likely only seconds passed as I stood there in a silent standoff with the incomprehensible. Finally, I retreated, unable to bear the sensation that I was on the edge of something beyond my understanding. I returned to the nurse's station with my thoughts jumbled and my heart heavy. My co-workers looked at me anxiously, but none of us dared to speak of what we all knew was happening. Something unexplainable was unfolding before our eyes, something that defied all logic. The rest of the night passed in tense unease. Calls kept coming, each with new reports of sightings of the eyeless nurse in different parts of the hospital. Some patients even spoke of hearing whispers in the darkness, unintelligible words that only increased their fear. By the time dawn broke, I was more physically and emotionally drained than I had ever been. The faces of the patients and the stories they recounted were etched into my mind like ghostly images. Daylight brought a temporary reprieve, but it couldn't dispel the tension that had settled over the hospital like a persistent shadow. My name is Andrea Martin. I always believed my work as a nurse exposed me to the rawest, most real facets of life. I've witnessed pain, joy, death, and occasionally miraculous recoveries in those I care for. But I never imagined anything could shake me to the point of questioning my sanity and everything I knew about life and death. It all began when I was assigned to the intensive care unit at St. Mary's General Hospital in Chicago. It seemed routine, nothing out of the ordinary. I had worked in ICUs before and was used to dealing with the constant tension between life and death. However, something was different this time, though I didn't notice it at first. Before long, it became obvious. My patient, a man named John Parker, had been in a coma for weeks. According to the reports, he'd suffered a serious car accident. A truck had hit him while he was crossing a street late at night, leaving him on the brink of death. His injuries were severe, with traumatic brain injury and multiple fractures, and the doctors were not optimistic about his recovery. My job was straightforward: monitor his vitals, administer medications, and keep him comfortable. The first couple of nights passed uneventfully. I'd arrive at the hospital, take his blood pressure, check his oxygen levels, make sure he was stable. But on the third night, something strange happened. I was checking his vitals when I noticed a slight flutter of his eyelids. I paused, observing him more closely. Could it have been my imagination? I stood there for a few minutes, but he didn't move again. I shrugged it off as exhaustion. A typical night in the ICU can be draining, and sometimes the mind sees what it wants to see. Still, it left me uneasy. Later that same night, when I finally got home and went to bed, I had a bizarre dream. I was walking down a dark street, illuminated only by distant streetlights that cast long shadows stretching toward the horizon. I felt someone following me, but each time I turned around, there was no one there. The asphalt beneath my feet felt cold, and the silence was suffocating, as if the world held its breath. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a metallic crunch followed by a deafening crash. I spun just in time to see an enormous truck barreling toward me. The dream ended abruptly, and I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. It took me a while to realize it had only been a nightmare, but the realism was unnerving, and the sense of being chased followed me the rest of the day. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a bad dream, probably triggered by Mr. Parker's accident. But I couldn't help feeling it was more than that. Something deeper and darker. The next night, I returned to the ICU with an inexplicable sense of dread. Everything looked normal. The monitors beeped rhythmically, fluorescent lights glowed with their usual starkness, and John lay motionless, connected to tubes and machines. But as I approached his bed, I noticed his breathing was more irregular, as if he was struggling to remain calm. When I got closer to check on him, it happened again. His eyelids twitched, then opened fully. I jumped back, heart pounding, and watched him, waiting for him to speak or do something, but he didn't. His eyes were open, but there was no life in them, as though he were looking at me and not seeing me at all. After a few eternal seconds, his lids closed again, returning him to his comatose state. I rushed to the nurse's station to check his file for any sign of improvement, but there was none. This made no sense. I decided not to mention it. Who would believe me? They'd think I was losing my grip. That night, I barely slept. Whenever I did drift off, I was plagued by restless dreams, always featuring the ICU or John's lifeless stare. The following nights got worse. John began showing more signs of activity, not just the fluttering eyelids, but also subtle movements of his limbs. His breathing would sometimes become labored, and his mouth parted as though he wanted to speak. Each time it happened, I felt a cold dread fill the room, like I was witnessing something forbidden. The nightmares also intensified. I no longer merely walked behind John or replayed his accident. Now I was in the car with him, feeling the steering wheel's warmth under my hands, hearing the radio, sensing the tension in the air. I knew what was coming, but I was powerless to stop it. The truck's lights appeared in the distance, and in an instant, everything turned into a maelstrom of twisted metal and broken glass. I felt every impact, every bone shatter, every tortured breath. And when it was over, the silence was worse than the crash. I'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, the agony and fear lingering, refusing to fade as normal dreams do. It was as if some part of that nightmare clung to me, refusing to let go. By now, each time I entered Mr. Parker's room, I felt an almost tangible sense of foreboding. With every moment that passed, I was more convinced something beyond explanation was happening. It all reached a breaking point one night while I was on duty. His body was far more restless than usual, his hands clenching, his chest heaving. I moved closer, trying to soothe him, but the moment I placed my hand on his shoulder, he opened, his eyes wide, staring at me. This time they weren't empty. There was a spark of something there, something desperate, pleading for help. My own heart pounded as if it might burst. The heart monitor started beeping frantically, and I called for a doctor, sensing something was terribly wrong. By the time we returned, he was still again, but we could find nothing clinically unusual. The room felt charged, almost electric. I glanced at John's face, certain I'd witnessed something real, not a figment of my imagination. But no one else had seen it. That night I went to the hospital chapel after my shift. I'm not particularly religious, but I needed some kind of refuge. I sat there in near silence, just me and my chaotic thoughts. I asked for strength, clarity, a way out of this nightmare, but the weight on my chest didn't lift. If anything, it grew heavier. I returned to the ICU, determined to face whatever was happening. As I stepped into John's room, the air felt dense, as if something unseen pressed against my skin. I looked at him for a long moment, waiting for any movement, but there was nothing. Suddenly, the heart monitor screeched and John's eyes flew open, locking onto mine. His chest heaved as if he were trying to speak, and then his hand rose slightly off the bed, as though reaching for me. The coldness in the room became suffocating. In that moment, I knew John wasn't alone. Something else was with him, trapping him between life and death. And now it was turning its attention toward me. Just as quickly, the monitor went silent, and John's arm fell limp. Everything ended as abruptly as it had started. I stood by his bed, trembling, while the doctors rushed in, verifying that he was still stable. Nothing seemed amiss on the monitors. They wrote it off as a brief irregularity. I knew better. The nightmares stopped after that night, but the sense of dread remained. I resigned from the ICU shortly afterward. I couldn't handle treading that blurry line between life and death anymore, not after what I'd seen. I found work in a different hospital, away from the endless ring of trauma and the constant reminder of that oppressive presence. Yet I can't forget those days. Sometimes, in the quiet dark of my bedroom, I feel it again, that cold oppression that washed over me in John's room. My logical mind insists it was stress, an overworked imagination, or leftover guilt. But My gut tells me otherwise. I can still see John's final glance, the look of someone who had seen something beyond this life, something that terrified him to his core, and perhaps still waits, biding its time to come for me too.